Okay. The utilitarian approach to morality and ethics might seem a little unusual to you. It is one of the leading theories of secular ethics. I said that Cass Sunstein of the current administration once saw federal policies weighed by utilitarian reasoning, because he himself is a utilitarian. And Bentham, and it is the reigning theory in the criminal justice system in our own country. In other words, reasons for punishing someone that have to deal with protection of society, deterrence of future offenders, and rehabilitation of the offender are all attempts to bring about the best consequences for society as a whole, and all argue that punishment is justified because, on balance, you promote more good than evil. And so that's the reason for this scale. Utilitarianism basically asks us to balance out the good or the evil produced in doing, say, action A, and weighing it against the good or evil produced by doing action B, and comparing them on balance as a way of deciding, well, if you're saying, should I do A, should I do B? Well, which one promotes, on balance, the best results is how the utilitarians approach morality. And it might seem odd to you, but if you put it in context, remember we saw that David Hume's basic approach, his skeptical philosophy, revolved around trying to prove that a lot of things that other philosophers thought that they could provide rational justifications for, our views about whether the external world is real, whether we continue as the same person, whether there's a God, whether there's an immortal soul, and other things. I mean, whether there is a necessary connection in the cause and effect relationship, which enables us to say that there are stable universal laws of nature. Hume basically tried to challenge all these attempts to provide a rational philosophical justification for our beliefs there. And his first book was called The Treatise of Human Nature, because what Hume tried to argue is what philosophers before him thought they could justify rationally really has no justification, and we should be skeptical about those things. However, Hume says in the everyday affairs of life, he has to basically run on the same beliefs that other people do. That there's a real world, that the law, stuff like the law of gravity is going to hold, that he wants to write his books because he wants to be, the recipient of the accolades for having written them. So he thinks he's going to continue as the same person. But what Hume says is, when he comes to say, do I have good rational justification for these views, his answer is no. We believe them on the basis of custom. That is, it's what people in society believe. And he says human nature. In other words, not for rational reasons, but for irrational feelings. And this is also the view that Hume tried to apply to ethics and moral philosophy. his famous quote is that morality is more a matter of sentiment, feelings, than reason. Hume says, look, when I say something like stealing is morally wrong, all I'm doing is reporting something about my own psychological state. That is, that I have very negative feelings towards stealing. For Hume, I'm not giving you some objective statement about what really is right out there in the world. Hume's view of ethics is much like that of Sartre. Ethics is just each person's individual call. It's what I feel is right versus what you feel is right. So ethics becomes like a supermarket where we walk down the aisles and we just pick out, ethical principles we feel good about, and we leave those on the shelf like a supermarket aisle that we don't want to worry about. Other philosophers who followed Hume said, wait, the bottom line of Hume's approach to ethics is that we cannot reason our way to the solution of a moral issue. We can't objectively reason about moral right and wrong. And they say that's not where we want to end up. We want to be able to answer Hume's skepticism in the way that enables us to reason to the solution of a moral dilemma. Should I do A? Should I do B? What's the morally right thing to do? And here's where they get to the basis of their ethical theory. They say, you know what? We can answer some of Hume's skepticism if we take a different approach to ethics and morality and don't look at moral principles as something that are ethereal and beyond the realm of the senses in some, written into the fabric of the universe like Plato and Aristotle thought, or that reflect the commands and will of a transcendent, otherworldly God. Now, they try to argue that their approach to ethics is not anti-religious, but it basically is one where you can talk about the morality of something, leaving religious principles on the side, or so they thought. But they thought if we can get ethics down to earth, then we can answer Hume. And so how do they try to do this? Well, first of all, they want to make ethics about the consequences of what we do. Not following some abstract principle that might be beyond the reach of anything our senses can tell us about. But ethics for them becomes a matter of promoting the best results. What's the moral thing to do between A and B? It's what promotes the best consequences. And so, utilitarians, hold on, I clicked on the wrong thing. Since morality for them is a matter of balancing out the consequences of our actions, that's why I've got this chemical balance there. That's how we decide moral right and wrong. Now, for those of you who wrote on question 9, many of you got the distinction right. You read some of the material, I guess we pointed you in the direction of, between ethical egoism and psychological egoism. Now, we're not really going to talk about ethical egoism much, but ethical egoism and utilitarianism both fit into a broad category of moral views, of moral theories called consequentialist theories. And what these have in common is that as consequentialist theories, they say the only thing relevant to deciding whether something's morally right or wrong is the consequences that are produced by doing that action. And I suggest this in this diagram, right? C1, C2, etc. Consequence. So consequentialism holds that only consequences are relevant to the moral. When I say the moral quality of an action, whether it's morally right or wrong. In other words, no other factors are relevant. And some people criticize utilitarianism for this because, think about it, where are the results of what I do today? Where are they located on the timeline? They're located in the future, right? The consequences of my actions are always located in the future. And so if consequentialism says the only thing that's morally relevant are consequences, then it essentially makes anything that happened in the past morally irrelevant. It looks only to the future. I'm not going to say any more about that now. But this brings up the question, well, when we talk about consequences, the consequences for whom? Now, ethical egoism, those of you who wrote on question 9, says that the only thing that matters are the consequences for the person doing the action, the agent. That's why I have all the C's. Suppose this is a person making the moral decision and performing the action. The only thing an egoist has to worry about is bringing about the best results for him or her. And the consequences for somebody else affected by their actions are irrelevant. Now this produces some real problems, you know. Do you really want your repairman making a decision on what auto repair you need solely based on how it's going to benefit him? You'd like to think that he would make it also on what's going to benefit you best. But utilitarianism can enable us to take the consequences for other people into account, unlike egoism. It says the consequences we ought to worry about are the consequences for anyone affected by our action, or if, like Cass Sunstein, we're making a decision, we're applying utilitarian reasoning to a big policy, like whether to build the Bakun Dam, as you saw in the video, then it's the consequences for the whole of society. Now, one of the things that makes utilitarianism very attractive to a lot of secular moralists is it seems like a relatively simple theory to understand. We saw that Descartes tried to build his whole system on one truth, one axiom. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Utilitarianism as a moral theory leans on just one basic principle, what utilitarians called the principle of utility. Now, Bentham's own statement of it is flowery and convoluted. So in the slides instead I have two later kind of paraphrases, one of which is from Solomon. Solomon says, always act for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Always act so as to bring about the greatest net good, that is on balance, for all those affected by your actions. So that's what the principle of utility says. Now note it talks about bringing about the greatest net good. Well, how are you going to define moral goodness? We saw that Plato defined it in terms of this abstract form of the good. Some religious theories of morality defined it in terms of promoting the will of God. But remember, the utilitarians, in order to try to answer Hume, wanted to get ethics down to earth. So Aristotle talked about happiness, we saw, eudaimonia. The utilitarians actually went to a different group of ancient philosophers, the Epicureans, and they took an old theory called hedonism, and they made it more plausible to intellectual people in the 19th and later 18th century by giving it a universal twist. Hedonism basically says that we define moral goodness in terms of what promotes pleasure or happiness, and moral evil is defined as what produces pain or unhappiness in society as a whole. So morality for a utilitarian becomes a simple matter of promoting the greatest happiness in this world, in the world that we live in, and we can tell that, right? So they took this theory of hedonism, which for the old Epicureans was kind of more egoistic, you know. The old hedonists said the pleasure I should want to promote is my own. The utilitarian said, no, the pleasure or happiness is what we want to promote for the whole of society, right? Now, this is Jeremy Bentham, who you saw in the video, and that's his pupil, John Stuart Mill. See, I've been thinking about a solution like that, you know, when I leave this world. You know, you guys would be walking through here 30 or 40 years from now with your grandchild, you know, and there'll be this box in the hall. And they'll say, well, there's Professor Morawski in those boxes. Oh, I had him 30 years ago for Introduction to Philosophy, and there he is, you know. I actually talked to that guy you saw in the video, Ross Harrison, because I was over in Scotland for a different conference, not one on utilitarianism, but he happened to be at that conference, and he looked pretty much like he did in the video, because these were recorded around 1998, and I was over there in 1995. But anyway, so they adopt this theory of hedonism, which says that the only thing good for its own sake alone is pleasure or happiness. That is, there might be other things that are good from a moral standpoint, but they're only good, and the word is instrumentally. I'm not going to ask you that on a test, but if something's good instrumentally, it's good only as an instrument in promoting some other good. But what you want is the ultimate standard for good in ethics is something that's good for its own sake. And Aristotle made this point long ago. So, I mean, one way of illustrating this, okay, folks, it's louder than you think over there. Aristotle made this point. He said, you know, we need, as the goal of morality, something that's good in and of itself. And for him was eudaimonia, or happiness. You can say, well, it's good to eat healthy foods. Somebody says, well, why is it good to eat healthy foods? You say, well, if you eat healthy foods, you're going to be healthier yourself. Well, why should I seek to be healthier myself? And one answer you could give to that is that people who are healthy generally have happier, more pleasurable lives. But if you say, well, why should I want to be happy? Or why should I seek pleasure? Well, for hedonists, the buck stops there. Because that's the thing that is to be sought, not because it promotes some other good, but in and of itself. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, but Bentham's pupil, John Stuart Mill, tried to prove hedonism as a standard for ethics. But his reasoning commits a logic 101 error called a fallacy of ambiguity. In other words, you cannot use, when you're trying to reason, you can't use a word with one meaning in the premises and another meaning in the conclusion, because that means you haven't really established what you're supposed to establish. And so he says, well, I want to prove that pleasure is desirable as the ultimate end of morality, as what we ought to promote for the good of society. And how am I going to do this? Well, he says that pleasure is desirable as an end can be seen from this, that it is the one thing people actually do desire. Similarly, a sound is audible if it can be heard, so pleasure is desirable if it can be desired. But that's to talk about desirable in the sense of meaning number one. Pleasure is something that we can desire, that's able to be desired. But what he needs to show that pleasure is the ultimate standard of morality is desirable in the sense of meaning too. Not just that it's something we can or do desire, but it's something we ought to desire as the ultimate end of morality. And Mill, who wrote a logic textbook, commits this logic 101 error, and he doesn't really prove hedonism. But just to move on, Bentham, look, this happens with scientific theories too. Very often the first statement of a theory, of a new theory, is very cut and dried and simple and straightforward. But then other people react to problems with the theory, make objections to it, and very often in scientific theories, the theory becomes more complicated through time. Well, when Bentham got out utilitarianism in the late 1700s, in a book called The Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham thought we could talk about pleasure and pain in utilitarian reasoning quantitatively. Now, what is it to talk about something quantitatively? Suppose I said we can talk about the temperature in this room quantitatively. See, that's the problem. We don't have that building built across the street. Still got a bunch of liberal arts majors here, right? To quantify something or to talk about something quantitatively means we can measure it. And to measure something, you need a unit of measurement, right? And if we were talking about temperature, we'd be talking about a unit of measurement like degrees Kelvin or degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit, right? Well, Bentham thought we could do this with pleasures. Now, you got to understand, both Bentham and Mill wanted to reform the British legal system, which they thought had a lot of injustices in it. And think about it this way. We're going to look at an instance of utilitarian reasoning, utilitarian calculations. But Bentham knew that you weren't going to get out a piece of paper and make calculations to decide whether it's right to have dessert for lunch or not. But think of it in terms of a judge who's in the sentencing phase of a trial. And they have to make a decision about what is going to be a fair sentence for this particular offender, one that's not too harsh, but one that's harsh enough that it would protect society and deter future offenders. Wouldn't it be good if the judge had a way of making that decision that would be very objective and fair? And that's what the utilitarians thought that they were providing in proposing utilitarian reasoning. That now, you know, so, and if you're talking about a calculation like whether to build something like the Bakun Dam, or whether to build that new technology complex across the street, even though it means you're going to level a whole block of people's homes, or whether or not, you know, if you're talking about things like that, maybe you'd want to make some calculations. Maybe it would be worth taking some time because a lot rests on the result or sentencing somebody. So the word to remember when we're talking about Bentham is quantity of pleasure. He thought all we needed to do is talk about the quantity of the pleasure we're producing, and that's the only thing that matters. Bentham's famous quote is, do I have the roll up here? Somebody looking? Okay, here's the roll on. Bentham's famous quote is, quantity of pleasure being the same, pushpin is as good as poetry. And you say, well, what's pushpin? Well, I don't know much about pushpin, but it's supposedly a child's game on a par with something like pickup sticks. So what's he saying? The only thing that matters is how much pleasure you get out of doing an action. Nothing else is relevant. So, now, don't let the word calculus scare you. We're not talking about calculus in the same meaning as the calculus. You know, the subject, when you take it, you get a book that's that thick, you know, 3 or 4 inches thick. The one developed by Newton and Laplace. Now, there's a much more mundane meaning of the word calculus. A calculus is any system within which calculations are made. And so Bentham thought we could measure, folks, you're louder than you think. You know, I'm not going to separate you like a teacher would do in elementary school, but just keep it down, all right? So he thought we could talk about things and compare pleasures and pains in a system where we talk about things arithmetically, and he thought we could assign numbers to pleasures and pains, that we could talk about them quantitatively, that we could measure them. And believe it or not, he had a unit of measure for pleasure, which he called the hedon. So +1 hedon would be a unit of pleasure, -1 hedon, a unit of pain. And the hedonistic calculus, and I'm going to go through this, this is something I've used for years, but I think it illustrates utilitarian reasoning very well, and what it is to balance off different consequences and come up with a result that supposedly gives us the greatest good for the greatest number, or for everyone affected by our actions. Let's suppose and this simple example comes from the old Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Let's suppose you have a nephew, you're an uncle. The circus is in town and your nephew wants to go to the circus Saturday. You, on the other hand, would rather not go to the circus, but would rather stay home and read the book. But let's suppose you're a Benthamite utilitarian. And so you want to say, well, what's the moral thing to do? What's the right thing to do for everyone? Should I take my nephew to the circus Saturday, or should I just stay home and read a book? Well, here are some of the possible results you might take into account. So doing A would be taking your nephew to the circus. Let's suppose, as the uncle, you have been to circuses before. For you, circuses are been there, done that, boring. You're going to be bored if you go to the circus. You're not that crazy about them anymore. Well, boredom is unpleasantness. It's a mild pain. This gives you an idea that when utilitarians talk about pleasure and pain, it's more like pleasantness and unpleasantness. It's pleasure and pain in a very broad meaning. So let's talk about the uncle's boredom as being -5 hedons. On the other hand, you'll get some sympathetic pleasure out of seeing your nephew enjoy himself at the circus. A sympathetic pleasure is pleasure you get at someone else's pleasure, like what you might get at Christmas time if you're a Christian, or somebody's birthday, if you have a young child and they get a birthday present or a Christmas present, and you get enjoyment seeing them enjoy opening up their gift. That's what sympathetic pleasure is. It's not going to be very high. Let's call it +2 hedons. However, let's suppose your nephew really likes the circus and he gets 10 hedons worth of pleasure at going to the circus. Now, of course, there are other things you might take into account, but just to make the illustration simple, doing the math, right, adding positive and negative numbers, it's +12 -5, or +7 hedons for option number 1. Right, or 7 hedons worth of pleasure for all concerned if you choose that option. Now, what about the second option, staying home and reading a book? Well, let's suppose as an adult you don't feel things as intensely as a young child, and so you're going to get some pleasure out of reading the book, but let's call it only 6 hedons worth of pleasure. But nonetheless, while you're sitting at home Saturday night enjoying reading the book, you're going to have some sympathetic pain knowing that you have disappointed your nephew by not taking him to the circus. And also, let's talk about the nephew's disappointment itself. So let's say you're sympathetic pain at knowing you've caused him disappointment is -2 hedons, and your nephew's disappointment itself is -8 hedons. Well, if you do the math on this, right, it's -10 + 6, or you get +4 hedons. I'm sorry, -4 hedons, right, on this side. Now, for utilitarian reasoning, it's not always a plus on one side and a minus on the other. It could be 2 pluses, but one plus is bigger than the other, or 2 minuses, where you choose the minus that's less. So, what's the moral thing to do then for all concerned? If you're a Benthamite, take the kid to the circus or read the book. What was the question? What's the moral thing to do if you're a Benthamite? reasoning things out this way in terms of future consequences. If you got plus 7 on this side, minus 4, right, it would be this. Now notice, for an egoist, it would be a different result. Because notice for the uncle's case, he's got minus 5 plus 2, or minus 3 hedons over here for just the uncle, and he's got plus 4 hedons over there. So for the morally right decision for all concerned, the uncle doesn't necessarily come out the best. But in Bentham and Mill's original view of this, if you're a utilitarian, you're supposed to be able to do what philosophers call taking the moral point of view. That is a disinterested point of view where you can stand back from the situation and assess it and make a decision for all concerned. And by enabling you to take the moral point of view, you can basically sustain altruism, right? Now, think about it. First of all, is it obvious to everyone what the numbers here are? Right? I mean, we don't have any disagreement over, the fact that this is going to be minus 5, and that'll be plus 6 over there, and that'll be plus 10. Everybody okay on the numbers here? Are you serious? Well, hopefully you're not okay on the numbers. Yeah, hopefully you're saying, well, wait a second, how do we know it's plus 10 versus minus 10 or something else? Note, as a utilitarian, I have to predict future consequences, and part of that is predicting things about someone else's future mental state. How much pleasure are they going to get out of A versus B, right? The criticism here is that it's unrealistic to think that pleasures and pains can be compared this way, since they're subjective and not open to public inspection, in the way that measuring the temperature in this room is open to public inspection. Measuring how much pain you have going on inside your head isn't. Yeah, we can talk about how you're reacting to it, but, as any poker player will tell you, you can hide how much pleasure and pain, you are feeling, right? You've just been, you just flopped a set, because you got 2 10s in your hand, and if you're playing Hold'em, another 10 came up, so now you have 3 of a kind. You don't want to look, oh, wow, I just flopped a set. No. You want to sit there as a poker player and not let the other players know that you just got a very strong hand delivered to you. So the subjective quality of that makes it hard to assign numbers. And also, this is a more subtle point. How do you know whether you have 2 or 10 or 20 of something if you don't know for sure what's to count as having 1 of that thing? And if you look at things like the definition of a yard or a meter, or a degree Celsius, there are very complex scientific definitions for what constitutes those things. But it's almost impossible to come up with an objective standard for a countable unit of pain for a hedon. you know. So the most you can do is make rough and ready comparisons. Yeah, we do say things like, my headache is much worse today than the one I had yesterday, right? I mean, hospitals ask patients to compare their pains on a scale of 1 through 10. But even that is subjective, right? All you're doing is getting the patient's attitude about their pain today versus yesterday. If they said, well, yesterday, hey, I was mellow at a 4 or 5, but today, man, I'm like a 7 or 8 on the pain scale. You know they're in more pain today, you know. But exactly what the numbers are is just a kind of subjective thing. So even saying we can make these rough and ready comparisons isn't the same as saying that there's an objective way of assigning numerical values to pleasures and pains. So that part of the utilitarian project kind of goes by the wayside. Now, what Cass Sunstein was talking about, and let me jump ahead. One thing that we can talk about objectively is the almighty dollar, right? If we do an analysis comparing economic costs versus economic benefits, and we say the morally right thing to do in this policy is what produces more benefits than costs, then we're talking about those economic benefits and costs in terms of a countable unit that we do know something about, whether it's the dollar or the yen or the yuan, you know. So, you know, a lot of contemporary utilitarian reasoning is done via a cost-benefit analysis using not pleasures and pains, but balancing off economic costs versus economic benefits. But this is still utilitarian reasoning because it views the morally good as economic benefits and the morally bad as economic costs, and avoids Bentham's problem with the hedon. And basically, you're saying that you know, that it weighs the good against the bad and recommends action on the sides of the most benefits or the least costs. And this is utilitarian reasoning. So the more modern way of talking about utilitarian reasoning is with something like an economic cost-benefit analysis. But you still can talk in terms of pleasures and pains. We can talk about whether to build a Bakun Dam, balancing off economic costs versus economic benefits of building the hydroelectric dam, or we can talk about it in terms of balancing off the benefits for society of cheap electricity and more jobs and, you know, giving people a better life and a happier life versus the pain of the displaced animals and people in the forest. You know, those people that are going to be displaced if we build the dam. So, okay, and that's in the video. If you missed it, I'm going to give you a link. A link to that probably this afternoon. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Go on. We're going to do a little bit more on this, and then we'll do some review. And I need to sit down and figure out just exactly what we're going to have on the final, you know, so. Okay, thanks a lot for coming out, and we'll see you next time.